My mom called me the night before her 60th birthday and told me I wasn't invited. She said my stepsister needed to be the only daughter there. I remember the phone ringing that night like it was a physical punch to the chest. It was almost 10, the kind of late hour when I usually let calls go to voicemail, but my mother never called this late unless something was urgent or personal. I picked up, trying to sound casual, but my voice probably carried the tension I felt. "Hi, Mom," I said. There was a pause on the line, and then her voice came, calm but precise, as if she had rehearsed this moment. "Don't come tomorrow. Your stepsister needs to be the only daughter there." For a moment, I just froze. I could hear the clock ticking behind her words, like every second stretched longer than it should. "Wait, what?" I finally managed, my voice catching slightly. My mind stumbled, trying to process it. I had been planning this day for weeks, gifts carefully chosen, flowers arranged, a card written with every ounce of love and thought I could muster. The thought of being deliberately excluded made my stomach twist. "Mom, you mean you don't want me there at all?" I asked, trying to find some hidden context, some rational explanation I could cling to. "Yes, that's exactly what I mean," she said, almost too smoothly. "Sophie is my only daughter tomorrow. I want her to feel special." My throat tightened. The word only stabbed like a knife. Only daughter. As if years of shared birthdays, late-night talks, family holidays, and uncounted small gestures of care could be erased with a single sentence. I felt my hands tighten around the phone, knuckles white. My chest felt heavy, every breath shallow, like I had been shoved into a room that didn't exist for me. I couldn't speak immediately. A storm of emotions swirled inside me: shock, anger, humiliation, a deep, gnawing sadness. I thought about every birthday I had ever celebrated with my mother, every holiday where I had tried to be thoughtful, every time I had chosen to put her happiness first, and now this? A flat exclusion, dressed up in the language of special attention for someone else. I wanted to scream, to cry, to tell her she was wrong, but instead, I sat in stunned silence, my mind racing for some logical loophole. She continued, oblivious to the damage her words had caused. "I know it might hurt, but I really want this to be Sophie's day. You can celebrate another time, can't you?" Her voice was light, almost patronizing, and that infuriated me even more. Celebrate another time. As if my presence could be postponed, minimized, replaced. The words reverberated in my skull, each syllable another reminder of how invisible I had been rendered in my own family. I felt an immediate tightening in my chest, a mixture of indignation and grief that left me shaky and restless. I ended the call abruptly, without the polite assurances she probably expected. I couldn't speak. My throat felt too tight. I placed the phone on the counter and pressed my forehead against my hands, letting the room blur as the reality settled. My mother, the woman who had raised me, the woman I had devoted myself to emotionally, was telling me, quite plainly, that I didn't matter tomorrow. That my stepsister, who had spent her entire life learning to manipulate her way into the spotlight, was the only daughter who deserved celebration. My chest ached, not just from the injustice but from the recognition that this wasn't an isolated incident, it was a pattern, and I had just witnessed it in full clarity. Memories flooded in. Birthdays passed where Sophie had received lavish attention while my gestures went unnoticed. Holidays where my ideas were ignored or credited to her instead. Simple moments, an offhand comment in front of friends, a smile given to her while my efforts were quietly dismissed. Every moment compounded the sting. I realized, in a cold, precise way, that this wasn't about love or fairness, it was about control, favoritism, and maintaining a hierarchy in which I was intentionally marginalized. My stepsister's wins had always been inflated, my own contributions minimized. And tomorrow was simply the apex of that ongoing injustice. I went to my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the wall. The gifts I had prepared sat on the dresser, wrapped in bright paper, waiting for a celebration that wouldn't happen. I could feel the tears prickling, but I refused to let them fall, not yet. I had to think. My mother's words, precise and deliberate, demanded a response, not one fueled purely by emotion, but one that acknowledged the betrayal and maintained my dignity. My mind began to work, running scenarios, imagining confrontations, contemplating silent protests or subtle ways to assert my presence without stepping into the party she had claimed as exclusively Sophie's. I thought about calling my father, but quickly dismissed the idea. He had always been passive in these dynamics, the type to smile politely while my mother made the rules. Involving him wouldn't change the outcome, it might even make it worse, framing me as the drama she warned me against. No, this was mine to navigate, mine to process. And process it I did, over and over, sitting in the quiet room while the city outside buzzed unaware of my inner turmoil. Every syllable of my mother's call echoed in my ears. Each one a reminder of how carefully she had chosen to exclude me. How deliberate the decision had been. By late evening, The initial shock began to evolve into anger, a slow burn beneath the surface. The unfairness of it wasn't abstract anymore. It was tangible, immediate, and emotionally charged. I could feel my muscles tense, my mind sharpening. This wasn't just a moment of exclusion. It was a statement about how my worth was perceived by my own mother, and I would not let it define me. I would not allow Sophie's manipulations, combined with my mother's favoritism, to diminish my sense of value. I needed to assert myself, calmly, cleverly, and in a way that demanded recognition without lowering myself to tears or confrontation. I thought about the party itself. About the way my mother would beam at Sophie. The way friends and relatives would lavish praise on her while I remained absent. The injustice of it almost made me laugh bitterly. There was a way to make my absence matter, to shift the power subtly, to ensure that the favoritism was recognized for what it was, and that my absence carried weight. I could feel the beginnings of a plan forming, not of revenge in a cruel sense, but of poetic justice. A quiet correction to an imbalance that had persisted for far too long. Lying in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I let the hurt, the humiliation, and the anger settle together. They formed a foundation of clarity I hadn't had before. This wasn't just about one birthday. It was about years of being underestimated, minimized, and sidelined in my own family. Tomorrow, I realized, I wouldn't attend, but I also wouldn't disappear entirely. I would find a way to make my absence speak louder than any forced smile or polite applause ever could. The night stretched on, heavy with anticipation. As I rehearsed quietly in my mind, weighing every possible outcome, considering every nuance of family dynamics, and preparing for the subtle but undeniable statement I intended to make. By the time sleep finally claimed me, I felt a mixture of exhaustion, grief, and a simmering determination. The unfairness of being told I was less than, excluded deliberately, had been laid bare in sharp, painful terms. But so had my resolve. I wasn't just a bystander in this family drama. I was a strategist, an observer, someone who could turn injustice into awareness without losing my own dignity. Tomorrow would be hard, yes, but tomorrow would also be the beginning of reclaiming my voice, my presence, and my sense of worth. And for the first time that night, I allowed myself a quiet, private smile, imagining the subtle power my absence could carry. The morning of my mother's birthday felt surreal, as if the world was moving at a normal pace while I existed in slow motion. I went through the motions of my usual routine, showering, dressing, making breakfast, but every action felt muted, almost hollow. I kept glancing at the gifts I had meticulously prepared, neatly stacked on the table with care and love, and a pang of hurt twisted through me. They would sit there, untouched, while Sophie received the spotlight and the accolades, the only daughter, for the day. My chest tightened with the injustice, a knot of anger, humiliation, and disbelief that I could not shake. I remembered every past slight, each instance of my mother's favoritism toward Sophie, and the pattern made my teeth grit. When I was a child, my efforts to help with holidays, birthdays, and school projects were often ignored or overshadowed by Sophie's accomplishments. My achievements were minimized, my gestures unacknowledged. Even as an adult, I had seen the same behavior repeat itself: praise for Sophie, dismissive glances for me, subtle undermining that left me questioning my own worth. These memories, vivid and personal, made my mother's phone call sting like an old wound ripped open. I tried to talk myself down, to find some rational perspective, but the emotional pull was relentless. I could imagine her voice again, calm and deliberate: "Your stepsister needs to be the only daughter there." The words echoed, sharp and cold, highlighting years of favoritism and subtle emotional manipulation. I felt my hands clench involuntarily. How could someone who claimed to love me treat me like an afterthought, like a shadow meant to exist only when convenient? The betrayal was not a single event, it was a culmination of years, and the pain was raw. Friends called and texted, checking in, sensing the tension that had always hovered around family events. When I explained, in fragments, what had happened, they reacted with shock and sympathy. "That's insane," my best friend, Mara, said, her voice tight over the phone. "She can't just erase you like that." I nodded silently, appreciating the support even as the knot in my chest refused to loosen. "I know," I whispered, though no one else could hear the depth of my hurt. It stings in a way that's hard to describe. Like all the years, all the effort, just don't matter to her." The more I thought about it, the more my anger transformed into determination. I refused to be the forgotten daughter, the one relegated to the sidelines because of my mother's favoritism. For a long moment, I allowed myself to feel the full depth of humiliation, the ache, the sharp sting of exclusion, the frustration of having my worth minimized. And then, slowly, methodically, I shifted my focus. This wasn't about petty revenge or tantrums. It was about reclaiming my sense of agency, asserting that my value wasn't dependent on my mother's approval. And refusing to allow Sophie's presence to define my emotional state. I began imagining ways to assert myself. To make my absence meaningful, to ensure that the favoritism she was flaunting wouldn't go unnoticed. It wasn't enough to simply stay home. I needed a subtle, strategic plan that would communicate my worth, my presence, and the injustice of the situation without resorting to confrontation or anger. Each idea that came to mind was measured, calculated, and morally justified, designed to restore balance rather than inflict harm. The mental exercise, almost like playing chess, gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt since the phone call. Even simple tasks took on new weight that morning. Preparing coffee, arranging my own home, checking messages, they all became moments of reflection, small spaces where I could rehearse my intentions and anticipate the day's emotional landscape. I imagined how my mother and Sophie would behave, how they would seek validation, and how I could leverage their predictability without stooping to manipulation. I wanted the message to be clear: absence does not equate to insignificance. My value existed independently of their acknowledgement, and I would ensure they saw that. Whether subtly or overtly. I remembered times when Sophie had overshadowed me, taken credit for my ideas, or manipulated situations to her benefit. Each recollection strengthened my resolve. The pattern was undeniable: she thrived on attention, on being the preferred daughter, while I was quietly sidelined. But no longer. My plan would be a demonstration, a quiet assertion of presence that forced recognition without words. I would make the day matter in a way that was emotionally satisfying, morally sound, and, most importantly, empowering. By mid-morning, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The initial hurt had given way to a measured focus. I reviewed my mental notes, rehearsing subtle gestures, small interventions, and silent statements that would make my absence count. Each imagined scenario reinforced my confidence. I wasn't powerless, I wasn't invisible, and I wasn't defined by my mother's favoritism or Sophie's attempts to dominate the spotlight. I could reclaim my dignity and demonstrate, without shouting. That exclusion did not diminish my worth. When I glanced at the gifts again, carefully wrapped and waiting, I realized that the physical presence of the presents was less important than the symbolic power of my choices. They represented love, thoughtfulness, and attention, qualities that Sophie and my mother had temporarily disregarded but could not erase. I would allow the day to unfold on their terms, but on my own terms as well, quietly asserting that my care, creativity, and presence were not contingent on approval. That sense of internal strength, of moral clarity, carried me through the morning with a quiet, satisfying determination. By the time noon rolled around, I was ready. The phone call, the memory of past slights, the emotional weight of exclusion, all had crystallized into a single, coherent plan. I would not attend the party, but my absence would speak louder than any words. I would let my mother and Sophie navigate the consequences of their favoritism while I maintained my dignity, my emotional clarity, and my self-respect. The anger, pain, and humiliation had transformed into strategy, and for the first time since the call, I felt a controlled, potent sense of empowerment. As I sat quietly, visualizing the day ahead, I felt a small, private satisfaction. I had been hurt, yes, deeply, but I was not broken. My presence, my value, my dignity, those things could not be erased by a single phone call or a lifetime of favoritism. And tomorrow, when my mother and stepsister celebrated in the spotlight, I would be quietly asserting a truth they had refused to acknowledge: that I existed. I mattered, and I could choose the terms of my engagement with them. That quiet knowledge, that private victory, was the first real gift of the day, and it belonged entirely to me. The days leading up to my mother's birthday were a careful balancing act. I went through the motions of normal life, work, errands, casual social outings, while mentally rehearsing the subtle plan I had crafted. I knew I couldn't confront her directly, not without it turning into a messy argument that would only feed her sense of control. No, this had to be quieter, sharper, and morally unassailable. I needed my absence to resonate, to make her and Sophie feel the consequences of their choices without me raising my voice. Every interaction, every thought, became part of that strategy. I began by observing Sophie, watching her social media updates and listening for offhand comments about the party. She was blissfully unaware of my intentions, flaunting her excitement and the assumed center stage she would occupy. "I can't wait to see everyone tomorrow," she posted, tagging family members. "Mommy's big day, and I'm making it extra special for her." Her words were like a torch, illuminating the predictable pattern of favoritism I had long recognized. She craved validation, attention, and admiration. And I intended to let that craving guide her toward recognition of her own vanity. I also reached out to close friends. Not to complain, but to subtly set the stage for my eventual assertion. "I'm going to skip the party tomorrow," I mentioned in a casual tone, careful to emphasize personal reasons rather than resentment. Friends responded with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. "That's bold," Mara said. Are you sure? I smiled inwardly. Bold. Yes. That was the word I needed. My absence would speak volumes. It would be the quiet, undeniable statement that I was not invisible, that my worth could not be dictated by favoritism, and that exclusion did not equal insignificance. Meanwhile, I organized small gestures that would underscore my presence without appearing confrontational. I delivered a thoughtful gift to my mother's doorstep earlier in the week, leaving it with a note that was warm but unmistakably pointed, "Wishing you a happy birthday, Mom. I hope your day is as special as you imagined." Nothing accusatory, nothing dramatic, just a reminder that I existed, that I cared, and that my contribution had value regardless of her decision to exclude me. It was subtle, but deliberate, a quiet reminder that absence could still carry emotional weight. I thought carefully about timing, the optics of the day, and the likely reactions. Sophie would arrive first, basking in the spotlight, arranging decorations, setting herself up as the only daughter. My mother would lean into the narrative she had created, praising Sophie excessively while minimizing or ignoring my past contributions. I visualized every moment, anticipating reactions, and considering ways to assert my presence through subtle but undeniable signs of care, intelligence, and thoughtfulness. My absence would be orchestrated, strategic, and morally clear, leaving no room for gaslighting or deflection. As the birthday approached, my emotions oscillated between simmering anger and quiet anticipation. I remembered past holidays, where Sophie had always managed to eclipse my efforts, and I felt the familiar sting of undervaluation. But now, that sting was fuel, transformed into a careful, controlled focus. I was no longer the reactive daughter, hurt and bewildered by favoritism. I was a strategist, capable of asserting influence without confrontation, of highlighting injustice without raising my voice. Each thought, each rehearsal of potential outcomes, sharpened my resolve. I also considered the broader context, family dynamics, social expectations, and the psychology of favoritism. My mother's obsession with creating an image of perfection had always driven her behavior. Sophie, learning early how to navigate that need for validation, had become skilled at monopolizing attention. But both were predictable. Their desire for admiration and perfection could be leveraged, subtly and ethically, to reveal the consequences of exclusion. It wasn't about cruelty. It was about illuminating reality in a way that words alone could never achieve. By the evening before the birthday, I had finalized every detail of my plan. I would not attend the gathering in person, but I would assert my presence through carefully considered gestures, timing, and symbolic statements. Each action was designed to underscore my value without descending into petty conflict or dramatics. The anticipation was electric, a low hum of satisfaction that kept me alert and focused. I knew that tomorrow, when my mother and Sophie celebrated, my carefully orchestrated absence would make them confront their choices. However subtly. I rehearsed my internal narrative repeatedly, imagining my mother and Sophie in the living room, their attention focused entirely on each other. In my mind, I placed the thoughtful gifts I had prepared in visible, meaningful locations. I envisioned the text messages I would send, the phone calls I would make, all calibrated to communicate care, thoughtfulness, and moral clarity. Each imagined scenario strengthened my confidence, reminding me that influence did not require physical presence, and that absence, when wielded with intention, could speak louder than attendance. The night was quiet. My home bathed in the soft glow of lamps I had arranged, a sense of control enveloping me. I reflected on the years of subtle favoritism, the undercurrent of exclusion, and the repeated patterns that had shaped my family relationships. Anger had transformed into clarity, grief into strategy. I was ready, not for confrontation, but for subtle, undeniable assertion. My mother and Sophie had set the stage. I simply had to navigate it with intelligence, patience, and moral certainty. Finally, as I went to bed, I felt a strange mixture of vulnerability and empowerment. I was hurt, undeniably, but I was also resolute. The narrative had shifted in my mind. I was no longer a passive observer in my family's dynamics. Tomorrow, through absence, through careful gestures, and through moral precision, I would demonstrate that my value was independent of favoritism, that care and thoughtfulness were not nullified by exclusion, and that being sidelined did not diminish my presence. It was a quiet, controlled anticipation, a slow-burning satisfaction that promised recognition without confrontation. As I drifted into sleep, I rehearsed the day one final time, imagining every interaction, every reaction, every subtle signal that would communicate my presence and worth. I allowed myself a small, private smile, knowing that the control, dignity, and clarity I had cultivated would speak louder than any forced smiles, applause, or verbal acknowledgement ever could. I was no longer the overlooked daughter. I was a strategist, an observer, and an agent of quiet justice. Tomorrow would be the first chapter of that assertion. The morning of my mother's birthday arrived with an almost surreal clarity. I dressed carefully, deliberately choosing clothes that reflected my personality, elegant but understated, thoughtful but not ostentatious. I could have thrown myself into drama, stormed the house, or confronted my mother directly, but that wasn't the point. My absence had power. The gifts I had prepared were ready, wrapped and labeled with a quiet dignity, waiting to speak for me in my stead. Each package, carefully considered, became a silent statement: I cared, I contributed, and I existed. Whether or not they acknowledged it. I left early. My car gliding down familiar streets, the city waking up around me, oblivious to the tension I carried. I thought about how Sophie would arrive first, how she would rush in, claiming the spotlight with practiced ease. My mother would beam, her attention entirely consumed by the performance she had orchestrated. But I didn't feel jealousy or despair, I felt control, a quiet power derived from refusing to be invisible. I had crafted the day, in spirit if not in presence. And every detail I had considered would assert itself quietly. Unmistakably. I drove to a small cafe a few blocks from their house. A neutral territory where I could observe without participating. From there, I watched the house, imagining the scene unfolding inside, Sophie bustling around, meticulously arranging decorations, adjusting napkins, rehearsing smiles for the photos she would take. I pictured my mother hovering, showering attention and praise, unaware of the tension my absence created. I allowed myself a small, private smile, savoring the inevitability that exclusion always carries consequences. Even when delayed or subtle. As expected, the first wave of guests arrived. And I watched Sophie interact with them, her smile practiced, her tone just high enough to convey enthusiasm. I noticed how she sought validation at every turn, positioning herself as the perfect daughter, the orchestrator of celebration. Each compliment she received, each photograph taken in her proximity, reinforced the narrative my mother had carefully constructed, but it also underscored the vacuum my absence created. Where I would have added warmth, humor, and genuine connection, there was now an echo. A subtle but palpable lack. I sent a brief text to my mother. Almost casual, almost indifferent: Happy birthday, Mom. I hope your day is wonderful. Nothing dramatic. No accusation, no demand for acknowledgement. Yet I knew the message carried weight. The calm, measured tone was deliberate, a reminder that I existed, that my care was intact, and that my dignity remained unshaken. It was a quiet assertion, a moral statement that could not be ignored even in my absence. Inside the house, subtle fractures began to emerge. Sophie, accustomed to undivided attention, started to notice small gaps in the dynamic she had expected to dominate. A conversation that required historical knowledge she didn't have. A compliment she could not naturally respond to. A brief, awkward silence when she failed to recognize the nuance of someone else's memory or joke. I observed these moments from afar, recognizing that my absence had introduced a subtle recalibration in the social atmosphere. As the morning progressed, the gifts I had left became visible in the living room, strategically placed to draw attention. My mother paused when she noticed them, her expression flickering with surprise and something like guilt. Sophie glanced, a small frown crossing her forehead, instinctively aware that I had exerted influence despite my physical absence. The balance had shifted in subtle ways, quietly, precisely. The kind of correction that could not be dismissed with excuses or charm. Lunch arrived. And I continued to monitor remotely, receiving updates from friends who had been aware of my intentions. It's different without you here, one friend admitted, a note of awkwardness in their tone. It feels like something's missing. I allowed myself a quiet satisfaction. This was the point of my strategy, not to humiliate or confront directly, but to assert value and presence through absence. The social dynamic, long skewed by favoritism, was finally being corrected organically, without me needing to raise my voice. By mid-afternoon, the tension inside the house had grown subtly but unmistakably. Sophie's constant performance began to fray at the edges. Her carefully curated composure slipped during small interactions. My mother, sensing the shift but unable to articulate it, grew slightly impatient, her attention faltering, her compliments scattered and uneven. The absence I had orchestrated was speaking volumes. Delivering a message that words alone could never convey. Exclusion carries its own consequences. And value cannot be dictated by attention or approval. I spent part of the afternoon reflecting on my own journey to this moment. The pain, humiliation, and frustration that had followed my mother's phone call had transformed into strategy, moral clarity, and quiet empowerment. By refusing to participate in the theatrical favoritism, I had turned an injustice into a subtle but undeniable statement of dignity. I realized that my absence, combined with carefully considered gestures and timing, had allowed me to reclaim agency, redefine presence, and assert value in a way that confrontation or drama could not have achieved. As the evening drew near, I prepared to return home, knowing that the day's impact would linger. The atmosphere inside the house, the subtle cracks in Sophie's performance, the momentary hesitation in my mother's gaze, all of it was a testament to the quiet power of intention. I had not shouted, I had not demanded recognition, but my presence had been felt in every thoughtful gesture, every carefully placed gift, every deliberate absence. The day, once intended as a showcase for favoritism, had become a demonstration of integrity, strategy, and self-respect. Driving back later, I felt a deep sense of release. The storm of emotion that had begun with that late-night phone call had been transformed into clarity, confidence, and empowerment. I had turned exclusion into assertion, absence into a statement, and pain into moral action. The quiet satisfaction of the day's outcome settled over me, steady and enduring. A reminder that value is defined by integrity and thoughtfulness, not by who claims the spotlight. That night, as I reflected on the unfolding events, I felt a profound sense of closure. The birthday had not gone as my mother or Sophie had expected, and yet it had achieved exactly what I intended, a subtle, undeniable assertion of worth and presence. I had demonstrated, without confrontation or conflict, that exclusion cannot erase value, that absence can speak louder than performance, and that dignity, patience, and strategy are more powerful than favoritism or vanity. By the time the house emptied and the evening settled into quiet, I felt a deep, unshakable sense of relief. The day had unfolded exactly as I had envisioned. Sophie's performance had faltered, my mother had glimpsed the subtle imbalance, and my absence had spoken louder than any words could. Driving home, I allowed myself to reflect on the journey, tracing the line from that late-night phone call to the controlled, precise assertion of my presence without confrontation. The quiet satisfaction of having reclaimed my dignity was profound, filling a space that years of favoritism had once hollowed out. I thought about the gifts I had left, now opened and appreciated in the way I had hoped. My mother had admired them, lingering over details I knew she would notice. Sophie, too, had seen the thoughtfulness embedded in each carefully chosen item, her usual smug confidence tempered by the realization that I had participated in the day, on my own terms. I smiled to myself, imagining her momentary internal confusion, the subtle recognition that not everything was hers to claim or control. The lesson was clear, earned through patience, foresight, and moral precision. Later that evening, my mother called. Her voice was quieter than usual, tinged with hesitation. I saw your gifts, she said slowly, choosing words as if testing their impact. They're beautiful, thoughtful. I let the pause linger before responding. Thank you, Mom. I wanted to make sure you felt celebrated, even if I wasn't there in person. My tone was calm, measured, unwavering. No bitterness, no accusation, just clarity, integrity, and the quiet power of self-respect. There was a long silence on the line, and I could almost feel her processing, finally confronting the consequences of her favoritism. I suppose I overlooked how important your presence is, she admitted quietly, her words tentative. I didn't need more. Recognition, even partial, was enough. It was not about making her feel guilty or orchestrating shame, it was about demonstrating that my worth was independent of her approval, and that thoughtful action and integrity cannot be ignored. Even when excluded from a performance of favoritism, the following days were calmer but marked by subtle shifts. Family dynamics adjusted in ways I had quietly anticipated. Sophie, more subdued and aware of the limitations of her spotlight, began to navigate interactions with less certainty, occasionally glancing toward me with a flicker of acknowledgement. My mother, too, seemed more conscious of the implicit hierarchy she had maintained for years, hesitating before automatically privileging Sophie's perspective. The subtle recalibration of relationships, guided by absence and intentionality, was satisfying in a way that words could not capture. I spent some time reflecting on the emotional journey I had undertaken. The hurt, humiliation, and anger that began with a single phone call had been transformed into a deliberate, morally grounded plan. I had chosen strategy over reaction, patience over impulsive confrontation, and dignity over drama. The result was not only the subtle correction of imbalance but also a personal affirmation. I was not defined by favoritism, by exclusion, or by someone else's narrative. My worth, presence, and integrity were mine to claim, independent of validation from family members. Even with the tension of the day behind me, I carried the lesson forward into small, intentional actions. Conversations, gestures, and interactions became opportunities to assert presence, thoughtfulness, and authenticity. I noticed how easily one could reclaim dignity without anger, how absence could serve as a force for reflection and recalibration, and how the simplest acts of moral clarity could resonate powerfully in the hearts and minds of others. The satisfaction was enduring, quiet, and entirely within my control. One evening, as I reviewed photographs of the birthday from afar, I saw subtle signs of the impact I had orchestrated. Sophie's exaggerated postures, my mother's slight hesitations, and the visible prominence of my gifts were markers of the quiet, deliberate statement I had made. It wasn't humiliation for humiliation's sake, it was acknowledgement. A reminder that exclusion cannot erase value, that thoughtful presence is powerful, and that integrity carries weight beyond immediate recognition. I allowed myself a soft smile, proud that my actions had been precise, morally sound, and effective. I also noticed changes in myself. The experience had taught me patience, strategy, and the importance of asserting boundaries in emotionally charged family dynamics. I had faced hurt and betrayal and had chosen to act with intelligence, moral clarity, and self-respect. That empowerment was transformative. I realized that my sense of self-worth could not be dictated by favoritism, manipulation, or social expectation. It was inherent, enduring, and mine alone. That realization, more than any subtle statement at the party, was the truest victory. The following week saw a slow normalization of family interactions. Sophie remained confident but less domineering, my mother more reflective, and I more assured in my ability to navigate complex emotional landscapes. I had demonstrated, without drama or confrontation, that absence can assert presence, thoughtfulness can assert value, and integrity can command recognition even in the face of deliberate exclusion. The moral and emotional balance had been restored, subtly but undeniably, and I carried the satisfaction of that restoration quietly with me. Looking back, I understood that the journey had been about more than one birthday. It had been about years of subtle favoritism, small indignities, and the repeated erasure of effort and care. By choosing patience, strategy, and deliberate moral action, I had reclaimed my voice, affirmed my worth, and delivered a lesson in fairness and recognition that could not be ignored. The empowerment I felt was quiet but undeniable. A deep-rooted reassurance that dignity, intelligence, and thoughtfulness always carry weight. Finally, I allowed myself to relax, to let the tension of anticipation and strategy dissolve. I had faced the hurt, processed the injustice, and acted with precision and integrity. My absence had spoken, my gifts had communicated, and the subtle recalibration of family dynamics had been achieved. I felt a steady, enduring satisfaction, knowing that the lesson was delivered, my dignity preserved, and my sense of self-respect unassailable. The experience had been transformative, painful, and yet deeply validating. As I sat quietly in my own home that evening, I reflected on the entire arc of the story, the hurt, the strategy, the execution, and the aftermath. The quiet power of intention, absence, and moral clarity had been proven in practice. I smiled softly to myself, realizing that the most profound victories are not always dramatic or public. Sometimes, they are subtle, patient, and enduring, the kind that reshape relationships, assert value, and restore dignity without a single raised voice. Tomorrow, next month, or next year, the lesson would linger. And I, finally, had claimed my rightful place, recognized, respected, and unshakably present in my own life.